I'm a senior here at Brooklyn College, and it was about 2 years ago when I actually started questioning the essence of the Palestinian struggle. Prior to that, I'd say I was just another individual in the general public. I was ignorant. I never questioned the media, and we all, living in the US, in the Western world, we tend to hear the side of the oppressor, but never the oppressed. And that's when I actually looked further into, I did my own information, and I realized there's definitely more to it. There's another side to it, the side of the truth. The oppressed never have a say as to what's actually going on in their location, I guess. Without further ado, I definitely like our speakers to come and sort of give you an insight as to the essence of the Palestinian struggle and how you, in your daily lives, can actually impact and actually play a role in fighting against the Israeli apartheid. So Ben White, come speak.
Boy, that escalated quickly. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening with everybody. Thanks very much for coming out. Thank you for the host groups and the co-sponsors, and sorry to be making like a little bit of a late start because we were coming back from Drew University, where there was, we did a good event there. I know there's going to be an opportunity to have some kind of like Q&A as well after my presentation. So just for you to bear that in mind, like as I'm going through, if there's stuff that you want to go back to or want to raise, you can remember that for the Q&A. So I'm going to be talking about Israel, apartheid, not democracy. And just to give you an idea of how I'm going to proceed, that's an outline of the talk that I'm going to do this evening. And first of all, I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking what we mean and what we don't mean when talking about Israeli apartheid, like a little bit about that apartheid framework. Secondly, I want to say something about the Jewish and democratic definition that the Israeli state gives to itself. Thirdly, the section which will be sort of the biggest, I guess, in terms of content, is examples about Israeli policies as they affect Palestinian citizens of Israel and also as they affect Palestinians who live under military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then finally, as you can see, the fourth section, which I called Rethink to Reimagine. That'll be where I try and give you some ideas to try and sort of put everything that came before in a context, some maybe interpretations of what's going on in terms of the bigger picture. So that's basically where I'm going to be going with this. So Israel and apartheid. Now actually it's not a new thing to be talking about Israel in terms of apartheid. You can find scholarly articles and books using that framework going back some decades. But it's become more commonplace and more frequently used as a frame of reference for understanding Israeli policies. Of course, in the US, you had Jimmy Carter's book that played a role in popularizing the use of the term apartheid. But there's still, for some people, that is still a contentious word to use. People dispute whether it's valid in the case of Israel-Palestine. And one of the main sort of confusions that I think people suffer from is the following, which is why I wish to clarify it. When people talk about Israeli apartheid, no one is saying that there is an exact equivalence with what happened historically in apartheid South Africa. There is an interesting comparison to be made. There's similarities, there's differences, but that ultimately is not the way in which we judge whether it is appropriate or not to talk about Israeli apartheid. That's because you've got apartheid defined as a crime under international law, independent of what happened in South Africa. Obviously owing a lot to it, coming from the Afrikaans word meaning separation, that's the context we got to know the word, but it now exists in international law, independent of what happened in South Africa. It is, if you put it in these words, the words of John Dugard, a South African legal scholar who worked as the UN Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied territories, Israel's own version of a system that has been universally condemned. Those are examples of where you can find apartheid condemned as a crime in different international treaties and conventions. You can see most recently in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 1998. And what you've also seen happen in the last sort of 10 to 5 years is more academic work being done to produce scholarly analyses of Israeli policies within an apartheid framework. So just to give you an example of that, the Human Sciences Research Council, a South African think tank, produced that report in 2009. And in fact, John Dugard, the guy I just mentioned, he has just published quite a long scholarly article in, I think, the European Journal of Law, or something like that, analysing Israeli policies in terms of apartheid. So that's been a trend that has grown. And before I move on from the A word, I wanted to flag up something that not a lot of people are familiar with. But if you're interested in understanding what's happening on the ground today in Palestine, you need to read this document. It was produced by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That committee does periodic reviews of countries which are signatories to that convention, which amusingly Israel is. And last March 2012, it was time for Israel's periodic review. So the state brings like its evidence, NGOs bring evidence, etc. And then the committee produces its findings. And the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination's findings with regards to Israel from last March were unprecedentedly harsh. And this is the kind of language that they used. They talked about, quote, segregation between Jewish and non-Jewish communities and a lack of equal access to land and property inside the pre-67 borders. That wasn't inside the West Bank they were talking about. But inside the West Bank, they said there was a regime of de facto segregation severe enough to prompt them to remind Israel of the prohibition of apartheid. And that was the first time that committee had used the term apartheid or felt forced to remind a state party of the ban on apartheid since the time of South Africa. So I'm going to move on from those sort of introductory remarks about apartheid as a concept, clarifying that it exists in international law, that people are starting to use it as a framework. And I want to move on to looking a little bit and unpacking a bit about the problems and the tension that exist within Israel's definition as a, quote, Jewish and democratic state. And the starting point for understanding the tensions within that definition is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that took place in 1948, what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe. That is a key moment, a key foundational stage for understanding the problems with Israel's definition as a Jewish and democratic state from that point onwards. Around 90% of all the Palestinians who would have been inside what then became Israel were expelled and prevented from returning home. And what happened in the first few years of the State of Israel's existence was that key laws were passed that were basically forming the structure of an ethnocracy rather than a democracy. And these are three laws that were very important, both individually and their combined effect. So you've got the absentee property law, the law of return, and the citizenship law. And what those three laws did was say that on the one hand, the property of the Palestinian refugees is now the custody of the state. It said that any Jew around the world can emigrate to Israel and become a citizen. And it stripped the citizenship of the Palestinian refugees who are now the wrong side of the new border. So these laws were defining the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion within this new state. And if you want to take just a few sort of key points home with you tonight, I would recommend that this one be one of them. The only reason why Israel has a Jewish majority today, a Jewish majority that it seeks to defend, is because of the historic and ongoing ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. The only reason Israel has a Jewish majority is because of the forced expulsion of the Palestinians, particularly in the Nakba, and the prevention until this day of their return. Israel doesn't have a formal constitution, which isn't unique. What it has is a series of basic laws that provide a kind of quasi-constitutional structure. And there's one of those laws that I just want to briefly spotlight because of the way in which the detail of it exposes that tension in the Jewish and democratic definition. Now that is Basic Law, Human Dignity and Liberty, passed in 1992. Now on the surface, both the name of that law and the text, if you just sort of skim read it, it seems like it's actually offering protection to minorities within the state. But then when you look at the fine print, as it were, you start to see the problems. This is from section 8 of that basic law. and the italics are my emphasis. There shall be no violation of rights under this basic law, except by a law befitting the values of the State of Israel, enacted for a proper purpose and to an extent no greater than is required. Okay? And what are those values? The values of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So in other words, the rights of the minorities that in theory are protected in this law can be trumped when necessary in order to protect and preserve Israel as a Jewish state. Here's another way of looking at it, courtesy of Ariel Sharon, the former Prime Minister, of course. He said this in both the UN and in the Knesset. He said that Arabs, again, italics my emphasis, have rights in the land, but all rights over the land of Israel are Jewish rights. And that is not just a small semantic difference. That is a big difference that he's making. What he's saying is, to paraphrase him, that okay, we have some Arabs here, like it or not, and we don't, and they have some conditional rights, but ultimately the rights to the land itself, according to Ariel Sharon, belong to the Jewish people in general. Ruth Gavison, an Israeli legal scholar, a prominent Israeli legal scholar, wrote an essay a decade ago defending Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So she's trying to make it seem as convincing and as positive as possible. But unlike some other people, she was honest about what that means for Palestinians. She put this: the Jewish state is thus an enterprise in which the Arabs are not equal partners. Remember, she's not talking about Arabs in Jordan or Lebanon or Egypt. She's talking about Palestinians with citizenship, who are in theory in a democracy or on an equal footing. And she went on to be specific. The needs of Jewish nationalism justify certain restrictions on the Arab population in Israel, particularly in areas such as security, land distribution, population dispersal, and education. So sometimes someone will say to you something along the lines of, well, you know, it can't be that easy for the Arabs in Israel, the Palestinians, because they can't sing along with the national anthem or identify with the flag, as if it's just simply a question of sort of emotion. As you can see here, and as I'm about to give you examples of, Israel's definition as a Jewish state entails material and systematic discrimination for its non-Jewish Palestinian citizens. So as I said, the majority of what I'm presenting this evening is going to be examples of what that looks like, because many of these are policies that people in the West have little or no idea exist. So let's get started on that. So these are all policies, just to clarify, that affect Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. That's 20% of Israel's population. The historical context of the minorities' relationship to the state is one of land confiscation. Here's a few statistics to give you an idea of the scale of that. From 1948 to 1953, it's the first 5 years of the state's existence, 95% of every Jewish community established in that time period was built on the land of expelled Palestinians. Okay? Almost every single new Jewish community built between 48 and 53 built on the land of Palestinian refugees. By 1950, so just 2 years, the cooperative settlements, the kibbutzim, the moshavim, the so-called like socialist settlements, held 45% of abandoned being both euphemistic and a reference to the legal framework, or confiscated Palestinian land. Okay? What you're watching is a mass transfer of land from one group of people, the indigenous but expelled population, to the new population. By mid-70s, the mid-70s, 30 years after the state's creation, the average Palestinian community inside Israel, not talking about the West Bank yet, the average Palestinian community inside Israel had lost between 2/3 and 3/4 of its land through various mechanisms that the state had implemented in order to take land from these communities. And you can just imagine what sort of impact that has on a community, a town, a village, when that scale of land seizure takes place, in terms of the ability to naturally expand and grow, economically thrive, etc. In addition, 1 in 4 Palestinian citizens of Israel are classified as so-called present absentees. What does that mean? It sounds contradictory, right? A present absentee is a Palestinian citizen of Israel who is effectively an internally displaced person. In other words, they were forced from their homes in 1948, but instead of ending up the wrong side of what then became Israel, the wrong side of the border, they were simply moved to another part, or they went to another part of what then became Israel. But instead of being allowed to go back to their village, because they became citizens, instead of being allowed to go back to their village, their land was still taken. Their land was still confiscated under the legislation used to confiscate the land of the Palestinian refugees. So to give you an example, a family that I know in Nazareth, the grandmother who lived through the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of 1948, her family home is still standing a few minutes drive away, but inhabited by Jews because that community became a Jewish community. This is a picture that I took in 2008, and every year when the State of Israel officially marks Independence Day, the Palestinians mark Nakba Day, Catastrophe Day. And this is a march by Palestinian citizens to the site of one of their destroyed villages, in this case Safuria outside of Nazareth. Now, connected to the land confiscation policies is a set of strategies and a set of policies implemented on a national and a local level that has been referred to by the Israeli state itself as Judaization strategies. And what that means is, or the idea behind that, is that in some areas of the country, particularly Naqab, the Negev in the south, and the Galilee in the north, there are deemed, from the state's point of view, there are deemed to be too many Palestinian citizens in relation to Jewish citizens. And therefore you need to implement policies that will shift that demographic balance more in the favor of the position of the state. I'll give you an example of how that has been implemented. This is from the late 70s and early 80s. The Israeli government, working with the Jewish agency, created so-called mitzbim communities, which means lookouts. Okay? You can note in many ways the use of militaristic language in sort of planning legislation and planning policy. Mitzbim communities that were placed on hilltops in the Galilee, and you can see what was the rationale behind their location. According to a Jewish agency planner, it was to keep Arab villages from attaining territorial continuity. How's that for planning policy in the so-called only democracy in the Middle East? This is Israel's housing minister in 2009. He said that it was, quote, a national duty to prevent the spread of Palestinian citizens. What about this from Ehud Olmert, speaking then as the mayor of Jerusalem? Of course, he went on to become the prime minister. He said that it was, quote, a matter of concern when the non-Jewish population rises a lot faster than the Jewish population. Pause for a second, look at those quotes, think about that discourse, and imagine what that would be like in your own communities, in your own towns, if the highest level of elected officials were using that kind of language about minorities in your community. And what would you think about that? Where would you place them on the political spectrum? You'd probably place them on the far right. But in Israel, that's not a fringe opinion. That's an idea and a discourse that is informed and influenced state policy in every single Israeli government since 1948 to today. Another aspect of Israel's ethnocratic discrimination is the existence of many so-called unrecognized villages. Those are communities of Bedouin Palestinian citizens whose villages are not recognized by the state as officially existing. They're not on the map. Why? Because the state decided to zone where those villages are located as not being for residential purposes. But they only did that zoning after those villages were already there. So they wiped the villages off the map in a bureaucratic process, and now they're busy trying to wipe those villages off the map literally with bulldozers. Those unrecognized villages face massive problems in terms of connecting to basic infrastructure like electricity, gas, telephones, etc. And what we have nowadays is the Prava plan. And maybe some of you have heard about it because it's been in the news a lot. And unfortunately it's in the news a lot because it is proceeding through the Israeli government. There was another discussion about it in the Knesset yesterday, I think it was, this week. And this plan, at least on the surface, is all about developing the Negev for all of its citizens. But what that plan means in practice is the forced expulsion of an estimated 30 to 40,000 Bedouin citizens from their villages in order that those villages will be demolished and those people forced to live in government-approved shanty towns, which are all at the lowest level of Israel's socioeconomic indicators. Why? What is the sort of mentality informing these policies? What's the idea? Now, Shimon Peres, who for some reason that escapes me has a reputation as being a dove in the West, He doesn't often say the kind of things I'm about to show you in public, but he said these to US officials that were published in WikiLeaks. He said in 2005 to US officials that Israel had, quote, lost land in the Negev to the Bedouin, that's to Israeli citizens, right, and would need to take steps to relieve the demographic threat. Okay? That's nowadays Israel's president, that's Israel's current president, describing a group of Israeli citizens as constituting a threat to the state on the base of their race. That's a picture from the Negev, from Naqab. This is the village of Al-Arakib, which is a village that has become famous because of the number of times that the Israeli state has demolished it and that its residents have returned to rebuild it. You're talking like 50 times, actually. It's about 50 times, more or less, in 3.5 years, since the summer of 2010. And it has become a focal point of Bedouin resistance to these Judaization strategies in the Negev. And if you want a very contemporary update, on Sunday, the Israeli cabinet met in a special session down in the Negev, and in that special session, they approved the creation of a new Jewish community. Okay? Problem being, they approved it in the exact same location that there is currently an Arab community that is now set for total destruction and the expulsion of all of its residents. But that doesn't get on CNN. Another aspect of the ethnocracy, the role of admission committees. Okay, again, not a well understood aspect of how Israel enforces its control in the area. But admission committees operate in about 70% of Israeli communities. And what they do is they control and filter who can live in those communities. And the factors by which they allow or deny someone to live in those communities include the grounds of social suitability. So you can imagine how that is used in practice. In the words of international human rights NGO Human Rights Watch, the admission committees, quote, have notoriously been used to exclude Arabs from living in rural Jewish communities. Now that law, let's say those committees now have a legislated function in 42% of Israeli communities. And when that law was passed, during the debate in the Knesset, Israeli politicians who supported the role of admission committees and wanted to remind people why it was important to have them, put it in the following terms: that the purpose of them is to, quote, preserve the ability to realize the Zionist dream in practice. It's a very fancy way for describing planning law. And what that Kadima member of Knesset is saying is that the Zionist dream in practice, in his words, means the exclusion of Palestinians in order to create Jewish-only communities. And by the way, in an extra sort of bitter irony, many of the communities where those admission committees function have themselves been built on the land of ethnically cleansed Palestinians. And the final example I wanted to mention with regards to the ethnocracy inside the 67 lines is the way in which Palestinian husbands and wives are separated by Israeli law because of this separation law that's been around for about a decade. And what it does is, it says that it's impossible or highly restricted for an Israeli citizen, but in practice this almost exclusively applies to Palestinians, for an Israeli citizen to marry and to legally live with their spouse if that spouse is a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza. Okay, so if you're a Palestinian in Haifa and you want to marry a Palestinian from Jenin, you're not going to be able to live with that spouse inside Israel under this family separation law, right? Now, when Israel implemented that law to begin with, as an emergency law that it kept renewing, the discourse was one of security, right, which is obviously familiar. A familiar sort of excuse for a lot of stuff Israel does. And the rationale was, from the state's point of view, at least in part, okay, some Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, they've been gaining citizenship through marriage, and then they go on to commit terrorist attacks, and therefore that's why we're doing this ban. Okay, now even if you kept it at the security level, you could say, well, why not assess every individual, right? Why doesn't the security services assess every individual instead of a blanket ban? But that would be to miss the point, because actually the purpose of the law is different. The purpose of the law is part of the demographic struggle. And that was revealed as the years went by, including when that law came up before the Israeli High Court, which again is held up mistakenly as the sort of bastion of liberalism. that law came up before the Israeli High Court, and the judges supported the family separation law, and in their majority opinion, they used the following incredible phrase: human rights are not a prescription for national suicide. Right, that was the majority opinion ruling of Israel's High Court. Human rights are not a prescription for national suicide. Meaning what? Meaning that they recognize, because they're angst-ridden liberals, that the separation of a husband and wife isn't so great from a human rights perspective. But they knew that the role of separating husband and wives in that context was part of the demographic struggle to preserve the Jewish majority. And when a member of Knesset praised the High Court's decision in these terms, he said that that law was about this, quote, the separation between the peoples and the need to maintain a Jewish majority and the Jewish character of the state. Again, by the way, I ask you to reflect and think about what that kind of discourse would look like in your own communities and your own cities if you heard it from a politician. And just to give you a little glimpse of a comparison with apartheid South Africa, have a look at the language used in the party political platform just as formal apartheid was being established in South Africa. Either we must follow the course of equality, which must eventually mean national suicide for the white race, or we must take the course of separation. I'm going to say something now about what Israeli policies and what the apartheid regime has meant and continues to mean for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Remembering, of course, that those are Palestinians who have lived under Israeli military rule for almost half a century. If you're a Palestinian and you're under 50 years old in the West Bank or Gaza Strip, all you've ever known is Israeli military rule. There are too many things to go into, like within the course of this presentation, but just to give you a glimpse, this is East Jerusalem. Life for Palestinians in East Jerusalem who don't have West Bank ID and who don't have Israeli citizenship, but have Jerusalem residency. In East Jerusalem, life for Palestinians in Israel's united eternal capital means discrimination in housing, demolitions, discrimination in municipal services and education. It means the apartheid wall cuts right through Palestinian neighborhoods, separating family from family who are the other side of the street, or from their school or hospital or shops. Israel just held municipal elections, and the mayor of Jerusalem was re-elected, Nir Barkat. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. And Nir Barkat is a firm believer in maintaining an ideal ethnic ratio for Jerusalem. He believes that it's important to maintain a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. He's happy to confirm those beliefs in front of the media, the BBC, whoever it is. And it's not that that has a cost for him politically. In fact, he probably says that to win votes. And again, I ask you to think about the equivalent. If the mayor of New York City had part of his platform that he wants to keep the ethnic ratio of the city at a certain level and will therefore implement policies to keep it that way. Widen the scope to include all of the West Bank, and you're looking at 500,000 Israeli citizens living in illegal settlements, a network of colonies that has been established in defiance of international law since 1967. And because of that network of colonies, the Palestinians who live around them, who don't have Israeli citizenship or under military rule, are subject to a regime of control in terms of their ability to move freely. In fact, they don't have the ability to move freely. There's about 500 or more obstacles, physical obstacles, to Palestinians' freedom of movement. That includes checkpoints, which have the presence of soldiers, massive piles of rocks or dirt in the roads, trenches, gates, etc., etc. And alongside that sort of 500 plus physical obstacles, you've got the bureaucratic permit regime as well, okay, which Palestinians have to apply to the occupation authorities to get the permit to move from A to B. Then, of course, you've got the apartheid wall itself, most of which lies inside occupied territory. And again, another very important document to be familiar with is the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which meets in The Hague, sits in The Hague. And in 2004, having been requested to do so by the UN's General Assembly, the ICJ produced their advisory opinion about the legality of Israel's wall. All of the judges were in agreement, with the exception of one who, was the American. And their opinion was that the war was illegal in its entirety, so far as it is inside occupied territory, which is most of it, that it should be torn down immediately, and that compensation should be paid to the Palestinians whose lives have already been affected. Of course, that has not been implemented. Here's another angle. 60% of the West Bank. Palestinians who live in that area have to apply to the Israeli occupation authorities for a permit to build. If they don't get the permit to build, and they build anyway, then Israeli soldiers come along, say, oh, did you have the permit? Where's your permit? Or you don't have one. Okay, so you have to demolish it, or we will also demolish it for you. Okay, so Israel can say, well, look, when we demolish Palestinian houses, we're just enforcing the law. You know, in what other country would you allow people just to sort of build randomly and as they wish? How does that legal system work? According to a UN report in 2008 that surveyed the previous 7 years, 94% of all Palestinian applications are denied. Okay, so Israel sets up a legal system that is designed to fail the Palestinians. It's designed to make it impossible for them to build. And we're not talking necessarily houses here. We're talking shelters for animals. Friends of mine were delivered demolition papers by the Israeli soldiers outside of Bethlehem, including for an underground well, for putting a corrugated metal roof on a simple shelter. Just to give you an example, from 2011, Israel demolished over 600 Palestinian-owned structures in the West Bank, and in that year, European Union observers used this language. They said that what is taking place in the West Bank today is, quote, the forced transfer of the native population. That's what's happening today because of Israeli policies, the forced transfer of the native population. And as an aside, the EU, really good at producing reports, really bad at doing anything about them. Human Rights Watch, again, look at the language they use. Israel's regime in the West Bank is, quote, a two-tier system where Palestinians face systematic discrimination. Two-tier system, systematic discrimination. Remind anybody of anything in terms of historical precedent. And then there's the Gaza Strip, home to 1.8 million Palestinians. It's a majority refugee population. Many of them live a few miles away from their ancestral lands from which they were expelled in the Nakba. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, fenced in, subject to blockade. The restrictions on their movement go right back to the early 90s, which some people are not aware of. And of course it became much harsher in the mid-2000s. But if you want to have an idea of how disingenuous the Israeli military's talk of security is with regards to so many policies, have a look at this. Today, as we're meeting here today, Israel blocks almost every single export from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank. Every single commercial export from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, its natural market. On what grounds? Security? It's a security threat to the state of Israel for an armchair fashioned in Gaza City to be sold in Nablus? No, right? To ask the question is to highlight the ridiculousness of it. And in fact, that policy is based on a so-called separation policy, which is a political decision to economically punish the population in the Gaza Strip and to implement and enforce the separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Another example of that is the prohibition that Israel enforces of Palestinian students in the Gaza Strip from studying in West Bank universities. And, of course, the Gaza Strip is where Israeli apartheid is frequently at its most brutal and criminal, where Palestinians can be massacred with impunity, where Israel carries out war crimes without any repercussions. And I say those words, and we meet here today on the 1-year anniversary of Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip that lasted for 8 days, referred to by the Israeli military as so-called Operation Pillar of Defense, that killed dozens of Palestinian men, women and children, completely destroying dozens of buildings. And it was just the latest example in terms of the whole-scale pulverization of a majority refugee population living inside a fence. I don't know how well it's possible to see this sequence of maps. I don't know if it would help dimming the light where that's complicated. Well, I'll just press on regardless. But this series of maps here is produced by the UN, and I'm using it to show you just how Israel has colonized the West Bank since 1967 using different methods. Now that first map that you can see there, you can see sort of like purple or brown dots like all over the place. and those are the built-up Israeli settlements. That's like just the built-up area, and you can see how they've been sort of dispersed all across the West Bank. Now the next map adds a tiny bit of red, so small you might not even be able to see it, but that is the area that is taken up by the unauthorized settlements. Settlements so illegal, even the Israeli government says they're illegal. The next bit of red is land that is restricted to Palestinians because it's for the agricultural use of just the settlers. The next bit of red, much bigger, is restricted to Palestinians because that's where the Israeli army says it has to be able to train and conduct exercises in. The next area of red is restricted to Palestinians because it is marked as a nature zone, so the occupation is also very environmentally conscious. That bit of red, you might be able to guess, is now the wrong side of the apartheid wall. And the final bit of red, this crisscrossing across the West Bank, is the road network that connects all of these different elements of colonization up. Of course, it's Israeli control. So when you put all of those different pieces together, that's what you end up with. Okay, this is the series of Swiss cheese state collection of reservations that Israel has intentionally created in the West Bank to make it impossible for there to be a genuine Palestinian entity, independent entity there, and of course, in the meantime, to be benefiting from the land and natural resources that they've colonized there. And just two more, looking in at Jerusalem specifically. I'm just going to pop back here a second, if that's okay. You can see the old city of Jerusalem is here, and this dotted line is the unilaterally expanded boundaries of the Jerusalem municipality. And you can see the sort of purple blobs that go around in a semicircle, which are the Israeli settlements that they've built around Jerusalem. Now that map is from 1987. Okay, so that's what it looked around Jerusalem and that area of the West Bank in 1987. Watch the difference from 1987 to 2005. Okay, that's what happened around East Jerusalem between 1987 and 2005. Illegal colonies that weren't there were created from scratch. Other colonies were massively expanded, and all part of the Israeli strategy with this so-called Jerusalem envelope to cut off Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. All right, I've come to the sort of fourth and final section of my talk, and I've called this Rethink to Reimagine, which is also the title of the chapter of the last chapter of my most recent book. And what I want to do in this section is to provide some food for thought, some ways that I hope are useful for looking at an analysis of the whole situation, taking into account what I've covered so far. What I want to talk about is, initially, what I'm saying is the invisible green line. The invisible green line, and making the links. Now, just in case there are people here who don't know just automatically what the green line is, the green line is the so-called border between territory that Israel controlled before and after 1967. Okay, so over the green line is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So what do I mean by the invisible green line, right? Obviously I don't mean there's literally no big green line painted on the ground, but I mean it in two ways. Number one, I mean it in the sense that Israeli colonization policies since 1967, as you've seen from these maps, have effectively rendered the green line a practical irrelevancy in terms of how much of the West Bank has been incorporated into the basic fabric of the state. Okay, you can go from Tel Aviv to Ariel Colony, deep in the West Bank, if you're an Israeli citizen, and for you there's no green line, right? Now, I also mean it though in a second way. And I mean it in a second way, and this second way is more important for me in terms of understanding what the reality on the ground is now. The green line is invisible in the sense that Israeli policies on both sides of the green line have the same intent and purpose with regards to the Palestinians. So it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the Negev or Haifa or the Galilee or Silwan or Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem or the Jordan Valley or the southern Hebron Hills. Israeli policies with regards to the Palestinians have the same set of priorities in mind, which is maintain a regime that ensures the domination of one group at the expense of another group. The legal mechanisms can differ, but the goal and the motivation is the same. These are the words of Oren Yiftachel, an Israeli professor, who wrote a pretty useful essay a few years ago about this. And he said this: the colonized West Bank, the besieged Gaza Strip, and Israel proper, each with its own official set of rules, are merging into one regime system ultimately controlled by the Jewish state. Now, what he's describing there is a de facto one-state reality. The fact that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the Israeli government controls that area and the lives of the people who live there. And their regime is a discriminatory one. Here's another way of thinking about it. 1 in 7 Palestinians are second-class citizens. 1 in 3 Palestinians are under military rule. And half, or just over half, of Palestinians are not in Palestine at all because they're the refugee population that has been prevented from returning home. Here's a sequence of maps that might be similar to something you've seen before this panel. Just to go over it quickly, it shows Jewish/state land ownership over a period of time. So on the left-hand side, you've got Jewish land ownership in Palestine in 1917. Move along, you've got Jewish land ownership in 1947, just the year before the state's established. Next one along is 1960. So of course, like a lot has been coloured in the map because the state owns most of the land, holds most of the land. And right along on the right-hand side, it's today. And you can see therefore that quite a lot of bits of the West Bank have now also been eaten up and absorbed. Here's another way of thinking about this de facto one-state reality and privilege. This is about access. Okay? So on the left-hand side, like coloured in black, is where you can go as an Israeli citizen. Next along is where you can go as a Palestinian with West Bank ID. Next along is where you can go as a Palestinian with Gaza Strip ID. And finally, at the end, nowhere, is where you can go as an expelled Palestinian refugee. Take these two pictures. You wouldn't be able to tell from looking at those pictures which one took place inside the West Bank and which one took place inside pre-67 Israel. That's because the same thing is happening in both places. The demolition of a Palestinian property, while alongside, or maybe even in the future on top of, Jewish communities continue to build and thrive, etc. That one on the left is from the Jordan Valley, and that one on the right is from the Negev. So what I'm arguing is that many people, particularly in the West, need to rethink. And they need to rethink along the following lines. Rethink to have an approach to the situation that is based on the reality on the ground. Not based on what the reality on the ground was 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. Not based on what people like propagandize is the reality on the ground, but what actually the reality on the ground is right now. And we also need to rethink to have an approach that is based on the failure of the so-called peace process. Okay? Now, it's a bit of a generous concession to talk about the failure of the peace process, because you can make a pretty good argument for the idea that the whole official international peace process has always been about creating an eternal process with no peace. Certainly at least no peace with justice at its heart for the Palestinians. But let's just assume that the peace process was intended to make peace. It's been a failure because you're talking 20 years of the Oslo peace process. Israel continues to colonize land, continues to build in the settlements, Palestinians continue to be killed, etc. Also, rethink in order to move beyond occupation discourse. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that, but it's easier to do so by explaining what I don't mean by that. And what I don't mean is that we shouldn't educate, organize, do activism around the examples of where Israeli apartheid is at its most brutal, like in the Gaza Strip or in the southern Hebron Hills where communities face the risk of extinction, etc. But what I do mean is that we should make sure that those examples are put in their proper context and that we remember that they are one component of a bigger system. We also, and I would hope that this would perhaps be a little bit obvious based on the not even comprehensive examples I've given, we need to rethink the orthodoxy about Israel's democratic credentials. And as we do all of that rethinking, the inevitable will happen, and obviously does happen already, which is that we will have to resist attempts to make off limits, to fence off, to make taboo the discussion about whether Israel has a so-called right to be a Jewish state. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In Britain, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, a couple of years ago, he went in the media and he described Israeli settlements in the West Bank as, quote, an act of vandalism. Like, quite strong language, like he could have just said they're illegal or something. He used quite strong emotive language to describe them as an act of vandalism. And I'm sure you're all immediately thinking of all your own elected representatives in Washington who frequently condemn settlements in the same sort of terms. Now, what Nick Clegg wouldn't do, he's okay to say that, there was no consequences for him, like in terms of his career. But what Nick Clegg won't do, because it's outside, for now, the sort of limited space for dissent with regards to Israeli policies, Nick Clegg won't say on the radio or something like, you know what, I think we need to have a serious conversation about Israel's so-called right to be a Jewish state, given what that means for the Palestinian people. We also need to reimagine. So after the rethinking, there is the possibility of a positive act of reimagining. Reimagine a future genuine coexistence of equals. Now, regrettably, and this, from my experience, tends to happen the most on campuses, people take the word coexistence and they abuse it and they misuse it in order to defend and maintain a colonial status quo. Because coexistence, unfortunately for some of you, is not about sitting, smoking argila, eating hummus, and then going home feeling awesome about yourself, okay? Coexistence, real coexistence, only happens after you've broken down the power structures that maintain the colonial inequality. Then, real coexistence as equals is possible. You can also reimagine so that there is an understanding of self-determination that isn't based on separation or division, but instead of that is an idea of self-determination that sees two groups sharing the same land as equals. Reimagine so that our emphases are things like democratization and decolonization. And finally, reimagine so that instead of can we return or when will we return, Palestinian refugees ask what kind of return do we want to create for ourselves. I'm going to finish now, wrap things up. These are the words of one of the first members of Knesset, whose son became more famous than him, Shmuel Dayan, speaking in 1950. And he said this in the Israeli parliament: maybe not allowing the refugees back is not right and not moral, but if we become just and moral, I do not know where we will end up. Now I think there is an answer to that in 2013, that instead of being an answer of militarization, of walls, of tanks, of fear, of privilege, is an answer of hope and defiance. And I see no better way than to finish with the words of the late great Edward Said, who said this: coexistence, sharing and community must win out over exclusivism, intransigence and rejectionism. And the only thing I would add is that there is not any time to lose. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sundar Seth, President of Brooklyn College Student Federation of Palestine. I will be the moderator tonight for our discussion. Before we start the Q&A session, I ask everyone who goes up to the microphone to, for everyone to identify yourself, your name and affiliation. Each person will have 2 minutes to make a statement or ask a question. 5 minutes will be allowed for the speaker to respond. We'll take 2 questions at a time. When the 30-second sign goes up, we ask for you to wrap up your question or statement if you have not already done so. The time up sign will go up when your time is due. Due to the time constraints, we ask that all speakers end when their time is up. All decisions made by the moderator should be respected. Everyone is asked to respect all speakers and not interrupt while others are speaking. Priority to speaking will be given to those participants who have not already spoken. So if you guys can line up, if anyone wants to ask a question to Ben or make a statement. Anyone? Okay, so go to the microphone.
Okay. My name is Melanie Goldberg. I am an Israeli American, and my question is that any potential Palestinian state says no Jews, not no Israeli will be allowed inside. That's not coexistence as you described it. That's in the Hamas Charter, and that's described and quoted would also be a de facto state in itself, just like Israel is right now, if that's how you think. Wouldn't that also be apartheid?
Anyone else want to ask a question? We're going to take two at a time.
Hi, Ben. I'm Alex. I'm from the Brooklyn College Student Newspaper. You talked a little bit about the Nakba, and the way I understand it is that when it started, there were attacks on both sides, Palestinian and Israeli. Is there any way that the Nakba might be more complicated than just ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians?
Okay, two questions. The first one, talking about whether a potential Palestinian state would have no Jews, which I hope I'm right in assuming is not just a reference to like what you're saying as Hamas Charter, but also like sometimes what is referred to as comments by like Mahmoud Abbas, talking about how there would be no Jews settlers allowed in the state of Palestine. So, I mean, first of all, I myself support one democratic state. So in that situation, Jews and Palestinians are both living there as equals. So there's no sort of like issue from that point of view. And one of my objections to a two-state solution is the fact that it can often be based on the idea of ethnic separation, which I don't believe is like either an appropriate moral framework or indeed particularly sustainable. And also, of course, the sort of a question that you asked is about hypothetical scenarios, whereas what we have right now is an actual real life in the flesh apartheid situation. And of course, people who are opposed to racism would, I imagine, want to be more interested in changing an actual situation that is happening now, rather than a potential that may or may not happen. The second question, talking about the Nakba. Well, of course, the whole story of the Nakba and the years preceding it and during it and following it, because it can also be dated 47 to 49, is full of a lot of different elements in terms of Palestinian attacks on the Jewish community there preceding it. There's a Palestinian rebellion, which many Palestinians refer to as, in fact, the real first intifada, going right back into the 30s. So there is, of course, a long history going right back to the first Zionist waves of settlement in Palestine that lead up to the events of the Nakba. But I think from my point of view, you can't really, I don't think, talk about just ethnic cleansing. If you're a Palestinian, that is what the Nakba meant in terms of the destruction of a society, in terms of people being expelled from a homeland that they're still not allowed to go back to. And for me, that has to be a sort of key moral lens by which one is looking at the events of that time, and a way of understanding exactly also the real origins of and the seeds of what is happening today too.
Any more questions?
Some people argue that Palestinians accepted and took advantage of the white paper in 1939. It would have paved the way for a future Palestinian state. How would you refute this argument?
My name is Hannah Jahani. Can you please talk about how Israel has destroyed an idea of a two-state solution by building settlements?
Excuse me. Okay, so the first question about the white paper proposal of 1939, and if Palestinians had accepted it, whether they would have a Palestinian state. So there are different versions of similar arguments that are often made by people along the lines of if the Palestinians had accepted X or Y initiative, both predating the establishment of the State of Israel, including the so-called partition plan of the UN, and then moving forward to more recent peace treaty discussions, etc. If only they had accepted X, Y, or Z, then they would have a state or there would be peace, and so forth. I think the main problem with that question or that framing, particularly if you go right back to the time period that you went back to, like the pre-Nakba period, is that it misunderstands or doesn't give sort of full credence to the goal of the Zionist movement at that stage. And the goal of the Zionist movement at that stage was to create a Jewish state, which they knew would mean the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians who were there. So to ask why didn't the Palestinians accept this, for me, it's like looking at it the wrong way around. Why would the Palestinians accept a proposal to divide their homeland? Why would the Palestinians agree to the colonization of their homeland? And when you put it like that, for me, it makes a lot more sense, the so-called Palestinian rejectionism. It's a rejectionism of the colonization of their land, which I think is a rejectionism that most of us would share. The second question, has Israel destroyed all possibility of the two-state solution, right? I think I'm right in saying that was the question. Okay, so that has become an increasingly mainstream idea, and I say mainstream in terms of centrist, high reputation think tanks, mainstream commentators, and in fact that has gone up to the level of European diplomats and even US politicians and British politicians. Everybody hints at this is the last chance for the two-state solution, or we're running out of time for the two-state solution, all this kind of stuff, right? People warn about that as many times as Saeb Erekat resigns, right? So what's the idea behind that is that the settlements have made it impossible to create a Palestinian state. Well, as I showed you on the maps, that's a pretty good argument. But I, for one, am also a little bit wary about putting too much store or investment in an argument that says the two-state solution, as understood in an international peace process framework, is only impossible or only difficult to realize because of Israeli colonization policies. I would say that you can make a much stronger argument against the so-called two-state solution within the international peace process framework because it is based on ensuring that Israel remains a Jewish state in the majority of historic Palestine. Okay? If you remember one of the examples that I gave about the separation of spouses and the words used by one of the members of Knesset to justify that law, he talked about the separation of the peoples. That same member of Knesset went on to praise the idea of two states for two peoples, which is language typically associated with like the dovish wing in Israeli politics. Okay, you have to remember, like, you put the whole spectrum to the right, but whatever. He said two states for two peoples. And he was saying that based on the idea of ethnic separation. And that's why you find a lot of Zionists now arguing for a Palestinian state because they see it as the best way to ensure Jewish hegemony and dominance and privilege in the majority of historic Palestine. Okay? So yes, I say Israeli policies have obviously made it difficult / impossible as they stand for an independent Palestinian state to emerge in the West Bank and Gaza, but I don't think that is the strongest argument against what is referred to as the two-state solution.
My name is Marty Goodman. I'm a retired transit worker with Socialist Action Organization. Just want to second your thoughts on one-state solution, and I think we've had a two-state solution. It would inevitably remain a Zionist institution if it was turned into a two-state solution. Bush and others have endorsed the two-state idea. I think it's fundamentally flawed based on an apartheid system that you've outlined. I want to say also that concerning the original Nakba, that a Zionist, a right-wing Zionist, did a book about it about 10 years ago. I think his name was Benny Morris. He was a right-winger, but he did a very comprehensive study of how the Palestinians were systematically expelled from their villages. In fact, they had, I think it was 74 or 75 plan is the name of it. I'm not sure. But it's a very large book, extremely well documented by a right-wing Zionist who said, yeah, we did it, we just had to do it. And that's how really bloodthirsty and racist the way they look at things. I would just like to also inject, and this will be it, that the United States is basically propping up Israel with, what is the figure now, 2 billion, 3 billion a year? I don't know what it is. But we must end U.S. aid to Israel. Cut off all U.S. aid to Israel. We need to cut off all U.S. aid to the regime in Egypt. And in reality, it's U.S. policy in the Middle East It must go, it must be changed. U.S. presence in the Middle East must end for there to be a true Arab Spring in the Middle East. And it must start with the liberation of Palestine in what's falsely called the
Okay,
Israel.
your time is up. Thank you. Take one more question.
How you doing? My name is Ahmed Hamdan. I'm a Brooklyn College student. I'm part of SJP. And I just want to know if you can talk about East Jerusalem, E1, and how Israel is colonizing it house by house.
Sorry, could you mind just repeating that again?
Yeah. Can you talk about East Jerusalem, E1, and how Israel is colonizing it house by house?
Stop to answer. Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, like the first gentleman was more making a comment, and I would recommend, like everybody, read the sort of work that's done by the likes of Benny Morris. To just focus on the second question, talking about East Jerusalem and so-called E1. E1 is the term that is given to this area of land that is basically located sort of between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, one of the big colonies that's outside of East Jerusalem in the West Bank. And E1 has been a source of contention and is a tricky sort of point for Israel with regards to the international community, because even the US administration sometimes gets annoyed with Israeli policies, and it's perceived that Israeli settlement construction in E1 would be some kind of further death blow or whatever to the two-state solution. I think perhaps what is just as important, if maybe, well, let's not quibble about whether it's more or less important, but what's worth remembering at the same time is that actually there are also colonization activities taking place much more centrally in Jerusalem. Okay, the activities of right-wing Jewish settler groups that operate working with the Israeli government and with the Jerusalem municipality to move into Palestinian neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah, like Ras Al Amud, creating things like the City of David archaeological dig. Okay, those sorts of efforts are also just as important from the point of view of the impossibility of a genuine Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, which, in theory, right, is a key element of a two-state solution.
Before we continue, our last person will be the girl in the pink. So, okay, so that'll be our last question. You could continue.
Hi, my name is Alexia. I'm from Honduras University, Palestine. Lisa, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about sort of like the role that the African migrants and Jews of color also play in the apartheid system, because it's not like, you know, a clear division in the same way between Jews and Palestinians in terms of like historical ethnic cleansing, but that's also been a second-class status, and especially recently it's been a big issue. So just wishing to hear your views about that.
My name is Kareem. I'm part of the Brooklyn SJP. I was wondering if you could talk a little about the power plan to expel the Bedouins.
I'll do these two. Okay, so the first question, talking about the issue of the African migrants and Jews of color, so for example Ethiopian Jews. I think quite a lot of people have ended up seeing a video that did very well on YouTube recently, looking at the racism that African migrants have faced in Israel. Quite amusingly, about, I don't know, a few years ago, one of the numerous and frequently more hilarious Israel propaganda outfits, Stand With Us, produced material talking about Israel as being this sort of beacon of hope for migrants seeking to flock there from across the region. And I'm not sure if they've updated their material yet, but they're probably not going to feature the frequent racist attacks that have taken place against those migrants, the statements by politicians, the incitement, the broken glass and smashing up of shops that are sort of associated with migrants, etc., etc. Just one aspect I wanted to highlight, because of the way in which it connects to the Palestinian question, is the way in which the language used to describe the African migrants, they've used the word infiltrators. And in fact, the law that was initially applied and then to be rejected, and now they're doing it again, targeting the migrants, was actually connected to the first anti-infiltration law that Israel implemented to deny or to fight against Palestinian refugees trying to return. So in fact there is a very strong connection, and the connection of course is the so-called demographic struggle. Okay, the demographic struggle is against non-Jewish infiltration, whether it was a Palestinian or non-Jewish Africans. So it's a very important issue. It, I think for a lot of people, has exposed people to the sort of racism that is there within the society of people, because it's not so obviously part of the quote-unquote Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think it's been a way that people have understood stuff that they might not otherwise have done. And just something on the Prava plan again, which I mentioned briefly in the presentation, but just to recap, this is a plan now that's been a few years in the making, and it's the Israeli government looking at the Negev and looking at all the Bedouin community there, and the plan is to ethnically cleanse 30 to 40,000. We don't know the exact numbers because the full list of villages set to be destroyed has not been published, but it's about 30 to 40,000 is the estimate of Bedouin citizens who will be pushed out of those villages and those villages destroyed in the name of development, right? In the name of development. And they will be put into these shanty towns, these recognized Bedouin communities that have been recognized over the sort of last few decades, that are the poorest communities in the country. And just to give, I didn't mention this, but just to help you in terms of thinking about this, the Israeli government often says when it comes to the question of unrecognized villages, that it's not feasible or practical to recognize these communities because they're so small and isolated, right? But you know that is disingenuous, because at the same time as it's sort of saying that about Bedouin communities, it is allowing the creation of and sort of furthering single Jewish family farms, okay? Where it's just one family living there that is connected up to the basic infrastructure immediately, etc. So the Negev is a right now, unfortunately, the Negev is like a hotspot for understanding Israeli colonization practices.
Hi, my name is Israel. I'm a student at Rethink College. So 2002, at the height of the Intifada, presented Israel with around 1,900 attacks coming from the West Bank, where they'd be suicide bombings, stabbings, what have you. And so whether or not these were acts of terrorism, as Israelis would call it, or acts of freedom fighting, as Palestinians would call it, is, I guess, semantics. So the Israelis, Ariel Sharon was kind of forced to put up this wall and the barrier as a way to stop these attacks. And they did, statistically speaking, they did reduce the attacks by a lot. So would you agree or disagree that the wall was a necessary evil, or do you think there was another way around these attacks?
Hi, my name is Sarah Ali, and I just one argument that I often hear is that the problem of the refugees is a problem of the surrounding Arab states, and that they didn't take in the Palestinians, and that the that land of Israel is actually just a small piece of land, and why couldn't it just be given to the Jews, and the Arabs just go into the neighboring Arab states? How would you respond to that? Thank you.
Okay, I'll do this one so I don't sort of forget one. Okay, so the first question concerns the wall, right? So there's a few different ways to sort of think about a response to this question. One of them is the fact that actually, according to the Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence agency, one of the main factors in the drop in Palestinian attacks emanating from the West Bank was actually two things not connected to the wall. One, which was a unilaterally declared ceasefire by Hamas, and also it was because that in other ways the Israeli military had hit Palestinian groups, like because of the re-invasions in 2002, taking them to prison, assassinations, etc., etc. So first of all, the drop in attacks is not actually just attributable to the wall, which of course isn't complete, right? And actually every single day, thousands of Palestinians without permission to work inside Israel cross over and work illegally through the so-called security barrier. Secondly, within the context of international law, it's not simply a question of you can do what you want, if it produces a sort of beneficial result for you from a security point of view. And that's why the International Court of Justice in The Hague specifically said that the war is illegal insofar as it is lying in occupied territory. If Israel had built the wall all along the Green Line, strictly from an international law point of view, there'd have been no issue. But then you get to the interesting question of why was the wall built along the route that it was built? And then you understand that the purpose was to unilaterally define and set the borders of the Palestinian reservation, or at least to make a big step towards defining those. Because the route of the wall is designed to include illegal colonies on the so-called Israeli side. So from all those different angles, it's possible to sort of summarize and say that you don't simply, I mean, that's the point of international law, you don't just simply take any security measure. You could flatten and kill everybody in a particular area and therefore reduce the attacks to zero. But that's not considered a thing that is a correct or permissible act. So that, coupled with the fact that Israeli politicians themselves, particularly in recent years, have been very open about the fact that the wall's route and purpose is to define a border, which is an illegally defined border. Secondly, so the question of Palestinian refugees and their treatment in the surrounding states. Well, I mean, it's an easy thing to do, to condemn the ways in which other Arab governments have treated the Palestinian refugee population. Easy, because in many ways their treatment has been appalling. But of course, the people who normally raise that issue are doing so with another agenda in mind. Because the root of the Palestinian refugee question, of course, is in their expulsion by Israel. And if one was so concerned about the fate of the Palestinian refugees, you would imagine that you would be okay with them going back to where they came from. Because it can be pretty racist to assume that a Palestinian from Acre would be happy living in Amman, okay? Because they miss where they came from. They miss where their family comes from. They identify with the culture and practices and geography and family of where they came from. And a Palestinian isn't from Cairo or from Baghdad. They're from Palestine. So you can easily condemn, which one does frequently, and many groups work on this all the time, the treatment of Palestinians inside the Arab countries, inside the refugee camps in places like Lebanon. But that is not to say that we lose focus on why those refugees are there in the first place.
We already said that the pink girl was going to be the last question due to time.
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm a Muslim American, and I got a question that was pretty informative, by the way. Thank you for the presentation. You did talk about how the Jewish settlers is going to be a big obstacle for the peace process in terms of having settlements within Palestinian authorities. I'm concerned if you could explain on Israelis' policy of arming Israeli settlers, like the process of them, whether they have to be legal settlers or illegal settlers, how they could basically get permits to carry weapons within those settlements. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nardine Mohsen, and I'm from the College of Staten Island Students for Justice in Palestine. And my question is that for the last couple of decades, the United States has been the leading proponent in administering the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, while also maintaining Israeli military aid, which is up to $3 billion. It's $3 billion a year, $8 million a day, going up to $12 million a day. And also appointing people from the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee to administer and look over these peace processes. So they're obviously biased in this situation. Do you think movements like BDS movements or movements like this could beneficially and successfully counteract instead of just waiting for our government to do this?
Good evening. My name is Fatima Durara, and I'm a former student of Brooklyn College and the co-founder of the Palestinian Club before SJP, affiliated with other organizations as well. And I just want to say one thing and then ask a question for you. In case anyone in this room has any doubt, there's not a single Palestinian that will settle for a two-state ever. If they want to say that they are settling for a two-state or they're willing to take a two-state, ultimately the goal is to receive the one state, to have historical Palestine back. Maybe they're saying it like Mahmoud Abbas, who said, it's okay, I don't have the right to return to Safad, just to be diplomatic, in hopes to see a future in a single Palestine that is shared equally by everyone who belongs to that state. And what I want to ask you, Mr. White, is I was hoping that in your Rethink and Reimagine segment, you were going to talk about what the one state would look like, especially for people of concern to Israeli inhabitants in historic Palestine. How would that look like for them if the right of return was to be given to Palestinians? How would that look like in terms of relocating or resettling Israeli inhabitants of Palestine? Thank you.
Okay. So, first question was talking about the arming of settlers. I mean, I wouldn't like to be precise about this because I wouldn't say that I feel confident in saying an accurate answer. Obviously, it's possible for an Israeli citizen to have a permit to carry a weapon. Many settlers, Israeli settlers, carry a weapon. And of course, also Israeli settlers frequently are conducting attacks on Palestinians, often with the Israeli military sort of watching them, burning olive groves, conducting acts of vandalism, conducting actually what would be fairly described as terrorism, because it is the targeting of a civilian population for a political or ideological purpose. Okay, so the settled population, many of them are effectively an armed militia, right, in occupied territory, who are there as part of the colonization process. Not all settlers are like that, of course, because the Israeli government also made it a very attractive economic option for people to go and live in particularly the larger colony blocks. Secondly, the introduction to, or the part of your comment was talking about the bias and the problems of a US-led peace process. And I'm very glad that you asked the question about BDS, because probably I'd have been quite disappointed to have got through this whole presentation without advocating boycott and divestment. So I can do that now and recommend that people really do take advantage of the initiative and momentum that has been gaining around the world in many different sort of contexts of faith communities, trade unions, cultural workers, campuses, people who listened to the Palestinian call that came in 2005 from a huge coalition of civil society groups. And it came, and I'm glad you connected it to the failure of the peace process, because it came in the context of continued Israeli impunity. It came in the context of Israel not being held accountable through international diplomatic channels for their systematic human rights abuses and violations of international law. And that is where BDS fits in, because also it provides you, people sitting in the audience here today, it provides you with the answer, or at least one of a good answer to the question, what do I do now? Or what do I do next? And the answer to that is, in large part, I would say, look at opportunities in coalition with other people and other groups to be pushing boycotts and divestment type strategies and tactics. Finally, yeah, okay, so this is a really big, complicated question. Looking at the practicalities of a one-state solution. And I think it would be fair to say that a lot more work has to be done in this department, in this area, particularly sort of detailed, like academic, but also specific practical work that I myself have only seen happen on a small scale. One of the things that I thought of when you were asking the question was the work of the likes of Zochrot and Bedil in working together, looking at questions of the return issue and building and recreating Palestinian villages or communities and spaces for them to live, looking at decolonizing space. I know of some other people, some high-profile people actually, who are working on the question of education, for example, also. Like looking at how you would decolonize effectively the education system. But what I sort of think about this is that because the two-state paradigm has dominated for so long in many different sort of spheres, that there hasn't been any sort of investment in terms of time and energy and academic work or anything like that in doing what you're talking about. And that actually I think is what has started to happen a little bit, but will happen more basically, and it will have to happen more because it's not going to happen tomorrow, but that is what I believe is the sort of the destination the train is going. And as it stands, there aren't any sort of decent or comprehensive sort of blueprints to what that would look like, particularly with big thorny questions. So I would recommend like people looking up the work of some of the small groups that are working on the idea of decolonizing space and how that would be done. But I would also sort of say how much I hope that that will become a work that is far more developed in sort of the years to come.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Our event is over today. Thank you, Ben. We also have another event next week with 2 Israeli soldiers, one that refused to join the IDF and one that's talking about the occupation. So please go on brooklynsjp.com and check out more information about our next events. Thank you.
Are you going to put this on? Where did you get that t-shirt? I have to go watch this song. Come and say hi.